After 12 years, what happens to a man who is tied to the same post? After seeing her mother's silent death, what does a woman become? And what actually transpired when Elder Glenn's master was discovered strangled by his own chain on that chilly Christmas night in 1848? Some claim it was retaliation, justice, according to some. However, everyone agrees that nothing was ever the same again. Are you prepared to hear the tale they attempted to conceal? In the Georgian sun scorched Elder Glenn's land in 1836. The hush that hovered over its fields was as hot as it was. On the horizon, cotton grew like ghosts, silent observers of the daily misery theater. The rooms behind the mansion squatted low in the ground like abandoned tombs, while the mansion itself stood atop a mound of red clay. Sunrise did not mark the start of life on Elder Glen, and sunset did not mark its conclusion. It extended in a never-ending cadence set by the whip and Elijah Remsen's will. One morning, Nathaniel showed up with his wrists still raw from the shackles of Savannah's slave auction and a damaged lip. He was tall and quiet, and even the experienced hands seemed uneasy around him. The overseer's voice was rising, but he didn't flinch. He also didn't turn away when Elijah looked at his teeth like a horse. They stated he had escaped from 2 plantations before me. The remaining men thought they were taming the wild-hearted. On the 3rd night, Nathaniel attempted to flee. Dogs discovered him before the moonrise, but he managed to cross the mill and enter the row of oaks that led to the marsh. It was not a quick punishment. Elijah was a symbolist. An iron post, corroded and rooted like a dead tree, stood in the middle of the yard. Other than recollection, it served no purpose. A piece of iron looped through a collar made decades ago for a man whose name no one could recall, and Nathaniel was chained to it by the neck. He was to stay there forever and be fed once a day, unspoken to, and subjected to the elements, cold, rain, and heat. Ada, a 13-year-old girl whose hands were already calloused from midwifing with her mother, was tasked with feeding him. Elder Glen had never been abandoned by Ada. No book had ever affected her. She did, however, know how to read a temperature, induce a newborn to breathe, and conceal anguish from view. Nathaniel remained silent when she first brought a bowl of cornmeal to him. His eyes were the only ones that moved, measuring her slowly. After setting the bowl close to his feet, she took a step back. Weeks passed. The chain remained in place. Ada would occasionally sneak out with a piece of bread or boiled sweet potato at night when the quarters were silent and the wind was speaking through the boards. Nathaniel didn't inquire. He never gave her a thank you. However, he talked one evening following a thunderstorm that divided the sky. His voice was as gruff as bark as he added, "They think this post breaks men. It doesn't. It teaches children important lessons." From that point on, they conversed in whispered bits and pieces of rivers that ran beyond the hills of stories his grandmother had told him about a city named Philadelphia, where men of color lived freely, wore coats, and wrote letters. Ada listened, taking in each story as if it were a seed. Like a trickle of blood from a deep wound, the years went by. The other kids grew up. Some died, while others were sold. However, Ada remained, and Nathaniel, too, deteriorating into a rusty, fleshy statue. His back became bent and his beard turned silver, yet his eyes never grew dimmer. The iron collar caused scarring. When he spoke, his voice was steady and low. Ada once questioned why he continued to breathe. She didn't comprehend at the time, but she recalled when he responded, "Because chains have ends, even this one." The clouds around Elder Glen had solidified by 1841 into a white, inflexible dome. It has been 9 weeks since rain touched the planet. The cotton plants curled in on themselves, brittle and thirsty, and the fields cracked open like old skin. Harvest was unsuccessful. As tensions rose, distrust spread more quickly than any other seed. The drought was attributed to the slaves. Elijah Remsen looked inward, growing more and more certain that his land was cursed. He examined each motion, each muttered phrase. He carried a lantern and a revolver into the quarters at night and spoke to no one. Jacob Murch, the overseer, interpreted the quiet as permission. Penalties became harsher and less logical. There was no need for evidence to support charges. The only thing that lasted too long was a gaze or an obedient pause. Ada worked in the home for Evelyn Remsen, the mistress, whose face had been devoid of happiness ever since the birth of her last child. Ada read aloud from the good book, clothed her, and poured her tea. Book when Evelyn's hands began to shake excessively. Gradually, the woman started teaching Ada the scripture letters in a quiet, apprehensive manner, as though she were doing a favor she would later retract. Ada committed every verse to memory like a lifeline. Revelations, Ecclesiastes, and Isaiah. She carved them into the walls of her sleep, writing them repeatedly in her memory. Miriam, her mother, stayed in the quarters, a storyteller and a healer. She had given half the men were uncomfortable with healing, yet there were more buried and children on the property than she could name. They said that she was holding words. Miriam was held accountable when a baby calf was delivered dead one morning. Witchery was the charge. She was brought to the yard by Jacob Murch, who shackled her hands. Elijah remained silent. All he did was nod. Her blood stained the dust as she was thrashed in front of the assembled slaves. Ada could not turn her head away. Miriam passed away that evening. She was buried in unmarked soil behind the smokehouse. Ada refrained from crying. She served tea as usual the following morning. She responded when someone spoke to her, but during the quiet times she started writing on splintered wood beneath the attic floorboards of her room, using a shard of charcoal rather than ink. Verses describing the fury of divine vengeance. The Lord is a vindictive God. God of retribution, shine brightly. The book had stopped being a source of solace. An indictment was made. The length of the days increased. Evelyn's condition deteriorated. Ada spoke little while she nursed her with cold compresses and bark-infused tea. Evelyn placed a battered Bible in Ada's hands and remarked, "Sometimes the only mercy God gives is silence." Ada opened the pages that evening as thunder gathered over the hills. She hurried after finding a small letter in the fold of Isaiah 10. Remember the key. The page had a slight iron odor, but no explanation. Ada put the Bible next to the fragments of scripture she had scrawled in secret under her bed. She didn't get any sleep. The iron had carved itself into Nathaniel's bones by 1845. His once dominant body has become slender and purposeful, a sculpture of endurance, sculpted by 12 summers and 12 winters at the whim of the weather conditions. His eyes had not grayed, but his beard did. In the middle of the yard, the iron post was still there, slanting slightly now, its base engulfed by dust and roots. It was no longer mentioned. The kids didn't inquire. The supervisor stopped jeering. Even Elijah, who passed it every day, appeared to look through it instead of at it, as though Nathaniel had transformed into something unnameable and uncontrollable as a result of surviving it. Ada was a mature lady now, with a straight back, from studied obedience and calm lines of restraint on her face. She was neither lazy nor hurried as she made her way through Elder Glen's corridors with the ritual precision. However, the boards beneath her bed were heavier with attic room had become colder. They stopped talking frequently, but she continued to bring Nathaniel his food once a day, always at dusk. Their comments, however, carried the weight of stones thrown into deep water when they did. One night, when the Sikas were. Nathaniel broke their silence when the air stank of distant fire and buzzed louder than normal. "You've read it, haven't you?" Ada nodded. "The book?" She didn't respond, but she also didn't turn away when she said, "Then, you know the difference between punishment and justice." Nathaniel told her about the key that evening. There was also the iron one that fit his collar, but that was not it. However, another important, figurative, possibly spiritual, and concealed in vulnerability rather than metal. He claimed that, not out of cunning but out of vanity, Elijah kept the actual key hidden in the fold of Psalms, in the spine of his Bible, where no man would ever dare look. He said, "They protect what they fear. Furthermore, they are more afraid of the word than the whip." That night, when Ada climbed into the attic, her hands shook. She took out the Bible that Evelyn had given her and turned to the Psalms chapter. Something metallic pushed against her thumb between pages that were smudged with age and usage. Tiny, aged, and darkened. It had a rainy scent. She refused to accept it. Not quite yet. Rather, she put the book back under her bed and closed it, placing her palm over it as though to silence a heartbeat. Tension was suspended for the next 3 days. Elder Glenn had become quieter. The reprieve was fleeting, but the drought had ended. There was a disease in the hog pens. A youngster. 3 days after going missing in the woods, he was discovered, with his mouth full of dirt and eyes wide. Disturbed spirits were whispered by the field workers. Elijah swore more loudly. Evelyn stayed in her room. Ada stayed at Nathaniel's side longer than usual one evening and brought him a piece of cornbread. He sensed it. He remarked, "You found it." Not so much a question as a statement. Ada gave a nod. Nathaniel gazed up at the heavens. 12 years, he said. I just counted them by the moons, not by the winters or the lashes. Ada sat quietly next to the post. She put the bread in his hands for the first time, rather than at his feet. She said, "I won't be here forever." Nathaniel flashed a toothless smile. "I won't either." With frost curling around windowsills and breath visible in the air, the winter of 1848 arrived early. The Remsen house's corridors. The soil had solidified into bone, and the trees stood skeletal in the fields. December came with no color. There were no carols sung. Over the smokehouses, no laughter could be heard. Only the preparations proceeded. Year after year, rituals were performed as though nothing had changed. On Christmas Eve, visitors arrived from nearby plantations. The Remsens clung to tradition like an unfitting clothing despite their diminishing wealth. Candlelight flickered against old paintings, and the place smelled of cider and roast. Ada sewed the hem of Evelyn's gown, prepared the table, and silently dressed the apartments. Elijah was not in her line of sight. It had been days since she had. The slaves were made to perform that evening. The main chamber is filled with music, including childhood hymns spoken gently like over an open grave, lullaby. Ada stood beside the others, her eyes downcast and her voice steady. She did not recoil as the guests cheered. She didn't flinch as Elijah toasted the abundance of his land. Unnoticed, midnight passed. Ada disappeared after the last visitor had left. With just embers for light, the corridors were silent. Evelyn slept upstairs under a gray and blue quilt. Elijah was back in his study. The doors were shut. She didn't knock. The wind has increased outside. The fields murmured. She headed for the yard. Nathaniel was gone, but the post was in the same spot as always. Her breath caught at first because the chain was slack and coiled at the base like a snake. The collar was uncovered. In the frost, there were barefooted, purposeful footsteps that led to the home. She went after them. The main chamber was gloomy inside. The walls were covered in shadows. The floorboards were covered in long arms of orange light from the low-burning hearth. In the stillness, Elijah Remsen was lying hunched over in his chair, his mouth open as though he were praying, and his head cocked at an odd angle. His throat was encircled by an iron chain that was so tightly drawn that the skin beneath it had cracked. His wide, glassy eyes gazed into space. Behind him stood Nathaniel. His with each slow, deep breath, the chest raised as if it were recovering something that had been denied for a long time. Neither he nor Ada said a word. She moved closer and set a little, aged-looking key on the table next to the Bible. With inscrutable eyes, Nathaniel turned to face her and gave her a single nod. After that, he ventured out into the snow. Ada stayed for a long time watching the fire go out, the chain cool against Elijah's motionless body, and the first snowflakes melt on the windowsill without feeling sad or scared, like little vanishings. Elder Glenn had started to decay from the inside out by the early spring of 1849. The smell of abandonment, rather than decay, permeated the air surrounding the plantation. Untethered chickens roamed the yard. The fields are left fallow. Weeds choked their furrows. The cotton gin's gears rustled silently as it sat motionless. No longer did workers rise in formal lines at dawn. No one remained to give them orders. At first, there was little or no discussion about Elijah's passing. With each telling, the story evolved. His heart had failed, according to some. Some said it was an ecclesiastical decision. Some murmured that it was Nathaniel, clothed in darkness, born by ghosts and brought back from the tomb. The knowledge of murder surged beneath every stillness like a drumbeat only the doomed could hear. Yet no one dared to utter the term, out loud. Evelyn completely retreated. She refused to eat and shut herself in her room. Screams might occasionally be heard reverberating through the rafters, hymns sometimes. No physician was called. The house turned into a tomb that was kept in insanity and dust. Ada, for her part, disappeared. There were no wagon tracks to be seen. Her departure was not mentioned by any witnesses. However, rumors started to circulate throughout the communities north of the river, such as Augusta, Milledgeville, and even Columbia. Soft-spoken but brave, a black woman is guiding fugitives. She was literate. She was carrying a Bible with one red-stringed page, Isaiah 10. She was referred to as Sister Ruth. Mercy, according to others, was her name. She was remembered, differently by those who had known her once, in the shadow of Elder Glenn. They recalled a girl who saw everything, who scribbled scripture on splintered wood, who traveled in solitude, and who fed a guy chained to a pole. Nathaniel vanished from view. As revenge had been the final thing binding him to the world, several people thought he passed away that very night. Others claimed to have seen him years later, staggering through cane fields in Louisiana or preaching blood and fire in Mississippi swamp churches. He left no name behind wherever he went. Only the whispered weight of a story. Following Elijah's burial, the post was demolished, hacked, and burned as though eradicating the wood would purify the memory. However, they claimed that the chain would not melt. Blacksmiths made an effort. It was only partially consumed by flames before sputtering out, as if the metal would not forget. Elder Glenn was eventually sold and then sold once more. No owner stayed for very long. Without breeze, doors creaked. The tools disappeared. Kids woke up yelling. Some people said they saw muddy, purposeful, barefoot footprints in the parlor on Christmas Eve. Silence returned to the land since. They never survived more than one winter. Sometimes, however, visitors along the ancient Georgia highways claimed they could see her when the sky hung thick with gray and the cold arrived early. Standing where the home used to be, facing the woods, hands clasped behind her back, a woman in a fading shawl waiting for remembering rather than rescue or forgiveness.